Hello everyone and welcome back to another BOOKMAS video. Today we will be talking about my favorite reads of 2024. 2024 was truly such a wonderful reading year in terms of quality. I read so many 4- and 5-star books, so many wonderful reads, and it was so hard getting this list down to a shorter number. I do have, I believe, 28 honorable mentions, so we'll fly through those and then we'll talk about my top 10 reads of the year. There's no order to the honorable mentions list or the top 10. For the top 10, I'll go in the order that I read the books. I did also want to mention I did not include any rereads in the list. I just wanted to keep the list books that I've read for the first time this year. I already posted my most disappointing reads of the year, and I was so happy with that list because there were so few books to talk about on my least favorites list. So the fact that there are so many books that I could call favorites of the year makes me so happy, and I'm hopeful that 2025 will be the same. Yeah, I'm just very, very happy with this reading year. So without further ado, let's go over the honorable mentions. We have Tennyson's Poems, the Little Pocket Poets edition by Alfred Lord Tennyson, The Number of Love and On Wings of Devotion by Rosanna M. White, Birds of a Feather and Among the Mad by Jacqueline Winspear, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pierce, Elizabeth and Margaret, The Intimate World of the Windsor Sisters by Andrew Morton, A Kind of Spark by Ellie McNichol, Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, The Amazing Mrs. Pollifax and A Palm for Mrs. Pollifax by Dorothy Gilman, The Sea Before Us, The Land Beneath Us, and The Sky Above Us, all by Sarah Sundin, Arabella by Georgette Hare, These Silent Woods by Kimmy Cunningham Grant, Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon Volumes 1 and 2 by Beth Brower, A Million Little Choices by Tamara Alexander, The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope, The Vanderbeekers of 141st Street by Karina Yan Glaser, Autumn by the Sea by Melissa Tagg, Christmas at the Grange by T.E. Kinsey, The Christmas Hirelings by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and finally The Soul Mark and Carver of Souls by J.J. Fisher. Alrighty, but now we'll go over my top 10 list for the year. There's no order to them, but I will go in the order that I read the books. A couple of the books that I read earlier in the year, I will probably need to reference Goodreads just because it's been a little while since I've read the books and I don't have the best of memories. But the first book that I wanted to mention is called In Feast or Famine by Misu Andrews. This is the second book in her Egyptian Chronicles series, and this book was fantastic. It is biblical fiction, which is one of my favorite subgenres. I love this subgenre so much, and Misu Andrews is definitely my favorite author within this subgenre. I remember finishing this book and I just had goosebumps and I was tearing up, and it was just such a powerful, powerful read. What I love about biblical fiction is, depending on the author, but specifically Misu Andrews, Tessa Afshar, these authors truly strengthen my faith with their biblical fiction. It is fiction. There has to be leeway given in that regard because there's a lot that we don't know in terms of certain Bible characters' lives and what they would have done on a day-to-day, their marriage, that kind of thing. So the authors do have to take some license with, adding things to the story. I don't believe it is adding to the Bible though, and I think that Misu Andrews in particular is very good at balance. She is amazing with her research and her knowledge of the Bible, and she just does such a fantastic job of telling these stories from a more fictional perspective, if that makes sense. But In Feast or Famine is definitely my favorite of hers so far, and I do actually want to read the Goodreads summary. It describes this book perfectly. After 4-year-old Asenath's mother is murdered by Egypt's foreign rulers, the child is raised to be a priestess by her overprotective father, high priest of Egypt's sun god. For 15 years, Asenath is sequestered in the upper levels of Ra's temple, convinced it is her destiny to heal the land by becoming queen to the next Egyptian pharaoh. But when Egypt's foreign king instead gives her as a bride to the newly appointed vizier, a Hebrew named Joseph, her entire world is shaken. Beyond the walls of her tower, Asenath discovers treachery, deceit, and conspiracy that force her to redefine her destiny and weigh where her true loyalties lie. Can she still trust the gods of Egypt, or is Elohim, the foreign god of her husband, the one who will heal her nation during the feast and famine to come? I've always loved Joseph's story in the Bible, but seeing his story play out from Asenath's perspective was so fascinating. She was such a wonderfully drawn out character in this book. There's a lot of political intrigue, there's also a beautiful romance, and it was just such a powerful read. I loved this book so much. I adore Misu Andrews. And I just wanted to share one quote that really resonated with me when I read this book. It says, Elohim created time, so there is still a chance we could be awed by his sovereignty. He's never late, seldom early, and always follows his schedule, not ours. We must simply trust him. In Feast or Famine, I believe, is one of the very first books I read in 2024, and it just started the year off on such a bang. It was perfect. I loved it so much. Next up is The Lily of Lgate Hill by Mimi Matthews. This is book 3 in the Bells of London series, and so far my favorite. I still have to read the 4th book, but so far it is my favorite in the series. I adored this book, and it's not too often that I love a book that is solely a romance. I definitely prefer books that have romance more as the subplot, and there are other important things going on, but the romantic developments are happening alongside the main plot line. But this is one of those books where I was just swooning the entire way through, and again, that doesn't happen very often for me. So I loved this book so much. I loved the romance. I loved our 2 main characters. There was a lot more maturity and depth to the story than I was even expecting, and it just took me by surprise in the best way. I'll also read the summary for this one. It says, Lady Anne Deverell doesn't spook easily. A woman of lofty social standing known for her glacial beauty and starchy opinions, she's the unofficial leader of her small group of equestriennes. But since her mother's devastating plunge into mourning 6 years ago, Anne voluntarily renounced any fanciful notions of love and marriage. And yet, when fate puts Anne back into the entirely too enticing path of Mr. Felix Hertford, she's tempted to run right into his arms. No one understands why Lady Anne withdrew into the shadows of society, Hart least of all. The youthful torch he once held for her has long since cooled, or so he keeps telling himself. But now Anne needs a favor to help a friend. Hart will play along with her little ruse on the condition that Anne attend a holiday house party at his grandfather's country estate. No more mourning clothes, no more barriers, only the 2 of them, unrequited feelings at last laid bare. Finally free to gallop out on her own, Anne makes the tantalizing discovery that beneath the roguish exterior of her not-so-white knight is a man with hidden depths, scorching passions, and a tender heart. I just thought this book was wonderful. I loved the depth with both characters. Both Anne and Hart had real problems that many people face to this day, and it just felt realistic, and their misunderstandings and the things that prevented their relationship from developing, it felt realistic as well, and I appreciate how the author explored all of that. So it's definitely a favorite romance, a favorite book of the year. Our main male lead is a wonderful character. He was so faithful and true to himself, but also honest with our main character Anne. He was also hilarious, and I laughed out loud a few times reading this book. It was just wonderful. I loved it so much. Next on the list is The Beatryce Prophecy by Kate DiCamillo. This is the first book I've read by this author, and it will not be the last. This book was fantastic. It was beautiful, tugged on my heartstrings, such a wonderful middle grade read. I adored it. It's a fantastical magical story set in a world that feels kind of like medieval Europe, and we have this young girl who appears in this monastery and is discovered by a man named Brother Edic. She's curled up in a ball covered in dirt and blood when Brother Edic finds her, and she's holding on to this very ornery goat that is notorious around the monastery. But this young girl is holding on to this goat, and Brother Edic finds her. He is honestly the best character in the story. I adored him so much. This young girl's name is Beatrice. Brother Edic kind of nurses her back to health and discovers some secrets that she harbors, and they're very dangerous politically. And Beatrice ends up going on this journey, and it is just wonderful. I cannot wait to reread this book. I adored it so much. And the illustrator, I believe it's Sophie Blackall, she also did fantastic illustrations for this story. It was just such a wonderful read. I could not put it down when I was reading it. Beatrice is also a lover of stories, and I love this quote that says, "What does then change the world? Love and also stories." I just loved every character in this book. I loved Beatrice, Brother Edic. There's a young boy as well, I forget his name, but a young boy in the story. And Answelica the goat brought a lot of comic relief, and it's just such a wonderful but deep story, and I cannot wait to read more from this author. Next up is All Things Bright and Beautiful by James Herriot. This is technically the second volume in, I guess you could call it a series. It is, I believe, the classic memoirs of a Yorkshire country vet, and these are slightly fictionalized memoirs, so a lot of the characters' names are changed. James Herriot, his actual name was James White, and then the names of his wife and colleagues were also changed, but basically it is his memoirs of life as a Yorkshire vet in the 1930s, and it is so fun to read these memoirs. This volume in particular was so funny. There were so many laugh out loud moments and really heartfelt moments as well. It is quite detailed in terms of like animals giving birth and just different medical things that James Herriot had to do, and it is quite detailed, so if you do get queasy easily, this may be a little more difficult to read, but I adored it so much. And there are just so many funny moments with hilarious characters. I used so many tabs in this book, and the tabs were just moments that made me smile or laugh, and it is full of them. The chapters are kind of like vignettes. There isn't really an overarching plot. It's more just, you know, this day this happened, and then James Herriot delivered a calf and then vaccinated some horses, and it's just very episodical, but I adored it. I adored the way that his colleagues Siegfried and Tristan were portrayed. They are absolutely hilarious, and there were just so many funny moments, and the different characters that lived in Yorkshire at the time were portrayed in such a fun and cheeky way, and I just adored it. These memoirs are just perfection. They are so heartwarming and encouraging and inspiring, and I am so excited to read the next volume in the series. But that is All Things Bright and Beautiful. I adored it. Next up is a book that I just adored. Obviously, I adored all 10 of these books that I'm talking about, but this book was such a wonderful classic. I really took my time with it. I spent a few months reading it. I didn't rush it, and I just adored it. And I am talking about The Heir of Redclyffe by Charlotte Mary Yonge. Wow, this book was just phenomenal. Charlotte Mary Yonge was quite the prolific Victorian novelist, and a lot of her books are just not in print anymore. Most of her books, actually, and that is just so sad to me. She needs to go back in print. This woman was such a wonderful writer. I adored The Heir of Redclyffe, and it's not the only book in my top 10 by this author that I'll be talking about, but it is my first by her, and I just can't wait to read more. It was fantastic. At the heart of the story, we have the Edmonston family, and they are truly one of the best families I've ever read in fiction. They reminded me of the March family and are just so tight-knit and loving, and I love how family was portrayed in this story, especially with it being a Victorian era story. A lot of the times, we just don't see that kind of closeness in these types of stories and books written in the Victorian era, and that kind of family love and sibling relationships and all of that, and I just adored it. It reminded me a lot of the March girls in Little Women, and actually Jo March did read this book in Little Women, and a specific scene made her cry, and it made me cry as well. So the Edmonston family, like I said, is at the heart of the story, but they have these two cousins. One is Philip, and the other is Guy, who recently inherited Redclyffe. His grandfather owned it and has since passed away, so Guy inherited it. He is an orphan, so he is under the guardianship of the Edmonston family until he comes of age. And the story really picks up when we learn about this family feud, this ancient family feud between Philip and his side of the family and Guy and his ancestors, his side of the family. And it's intense, and it leads to a lot of issues and relational issues, and this book is really about relationships. It has really interesting themes, but specifically around family and the sins of previous generations falling on the children and those kinds of themes, and I just adored it. The dialogue was fantastic. I felt like I was there. These characters were so well drawn out, so perfect. Everything about this book was perfect. I didn't dislike anything. Other than the pacing. A lot of people have issues with the pacing, and I totally understand that it is quite slow, but I just couldn't get enough of it. I am very glad though that I took my time with it. I did spend a few months, like I said, reading it. I didn't rush it, and that just made for the best reading experience. There are a few moments that feel kind of gothic, and the estate, the home that Guy inherits, Redclyffe, there are some descriptions of it that feel very spooky and gothic, and I loved that so much. And there are so many emotional moments that made me cry, and I just adored this book, and I wouldn't change anything with the story. I loved it so much. Next up is a book that I just cannot stop thinking about. I think about it so often. I loved this book so much, and that is Born of Gilded Mountains by Amanda Dykes. She is currently my favorite Christian fiction author outside of like biblical fiction, just general Christian fiction. She is my favorite author. Her books are just full of beautiful, flowery writing, which I know doesn't appeal to everyone, but just the way she writes, it's right up my alley. I love it so much. There are moments where I'll read a passage of hers and think to myself, Ella Montgomery would approve. It just feels very poetic and absolutely beautiful, breathtaking, stunning, all the words. I just love this author so much. This book is set in the 40s, mainly in the Colorado mountains, and that setting as well was absolute perfection. I wanted to move there while reading this book. Absolutely beautiful. I love the mountains so much, so that was definitely a plus for me, that setting. But we have our main character Mercy, who was a Hollywood actress, and a scandal shatters her world. She has to leave and she decides to come to Mercy Peak. Her Hollywood name is Mercy. She comes to Mercy Peak. She had a pen pal growing up that lived in Mercy Peak, and so she is somewhat familiar with this small town in the mountains, and she purchases this abandoned mansion basically and learns of some mysterious things that were going on. She's trying to figure out what happened to her pen pal Rusty, who lived in Mercy Peak. This train engine that would deliver mail to the residents of Mercy Peak also disappeared, and so she's trying to figure out what happened. There's talk of hidden treasure, and there's just so many little elements to the story that make it such a masterpiece. I'm just going to read off the list of things that I wrote on Goodreads as reasons why I loved this book so much. I struggled to put my thoughts into coherent sentences, so I just kind of have point form, but these are the things that I just loved about this story. The music, there is a lot of mention of songs like Dream a Little Dream of Me and It Is Well With My Soul, and just a lot of music in the story, which I loved. The mountain setting, absolutely fantastic. The mountain lakes, the evergreen forests, just everything about it. It's my absolute favorite type of landscape, and I just want to live in the mountains so bad. The town, the characters, the tight-knit community, I loved that so much. I also do love trains and anything to do with trains, so with this vanishing rail car, it's a really fun element to the story. Of course, there's beautiful friendship. Our pen pals, Rusty and Mercy, as they're growing up, there are a lot of very sweet moments between them as kids. There's an element of found family, which I love. And I also really love that our main character, Mercy, is single. There's no romance in her story in this book. There is the potential for a romance in another character's story, but with Mercy there isn't, and I really liked that. There's mining and hidden treasure and such a beautiful map at the beginning of the book. There are riddles, the writing is so poetic, and it has that old Hollywood feel, and the main themes really are around grief and healing and restoration, and the author shared Joel 2:25, and that says, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, the great army sent among you." And it is really a story of restoration, and it's absolute perfection. I did mention that The Heir of Redclyffe was not the only Charlotte Mary Yonge book on this list, and the other book that I read by her and absolutely adored is Dynevor Terrace. This book was perfection, and it's a great place to start with Charlotte Mary Yonge if you've never read her works. Highly recommend starting with Dynevor Terrace. It's better paced than The Heir of Redclyffe, and I find the characters are a little more complex, and there's a lot more nuance than in The Heir of Redclyffe, even though I still adored The Heir of Redclyffe so much. Dynevor Terrace I just feel is better in certain regards. This book is so complex, and to try to summarize it would honestly be doing it a disservice. It is not a simple story. It is so complicated, and there are so many relational issues going on and character conflict, and there's just so much happening. It is truly a Victorian drama, and it's so good. It would make such a wonderful mini-series. This book is just wonderful. I actually really like the summary on Project Gutenberg. It just describes the plot so well without spoiling anything, but it basically says that the narrative centers on the intertwined lives of several characters, particularly focusing on James Frost, Isabel Conway, and those connected to them as they navigate love, duty, and social maneuverings. At the open of the story, we're introduced to a variety of characters and their emotional struggles. Fitz Jocelyn is determined to secure a relationship with another character while facing jealousy and competition. The dynamics shift as communication and secrets play a crucial role, with Isabel expressing a desire for honesty and directness. As the story unfolds, tensions arise with implications of duty and societal expectations, setting the stage for further exploration of love and relationship challenges experienced by the various main characters. And there are definitely a few characters that are very important to the story, mainly Fitz Jocelyn, James, Isabel, and Mary. James also has a sister named Clara, who I adored, but Mary was definitely my favorite character. She was just so strong, and her story was really interesting because she had recently come back to England with her mother from Peru, and we actually get to spend some time in Peru in the story as well, and we get to see the Peruvian culture in the Victorian period, and it was fascinating. I loved that so much. I just loved these characters, and everything was so complex in their relationships. And I also loved Catherine, who was kind of like a matriarch in the family, and she was just wonderful. All the characters were wonderful. Everything about this book was wonderful. And it's also described as an extended family chronicle, with all the main characters and many of the minor characters being either descendants or somewhat related through marriage to the Dynevors, which the title, it's Dynevor Terrace, but the Dynevors were an ancient Welsh family. So this book is set in Wales besides a little bit in Peru, but mainly in Wales. I also loved Lord Ormersfield, who is part of the Dynevor family, and just every character in this book was fantastic. I cannot wait to reread it. It was so, so wonderful. I loved Dynevor Terrace and highly, highly recommend it. Next up is a book I read for Victober, and it was definitely my favorite read of October. It was fantastic, and that is Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This one was just absolutely beautiful. I loved this book so much. It did kind of have a slower start, but by the end, I was sobbing. This book was perfection. Elizabeth Gaskell is my favorite female novelist from the Victorian era. I just adore her so much. I adore how all of her stories are so different. This one kind of reminded me of Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This one by Gaskell, as well as Ruth by her. They're kind of both similar, but this one, Sylvia's Lovers, was just fantastic. Our main character, Sylvia, she starts off as this very immature girl, and she's kind of in this love triangle with two men, Philip and Charlie. She experiences some betrayal, and one of the two men makes a decision that alters the course of all their lives, and it's intense. I really like that the story was set right at the end of the 18th century, and it's set in this fictional town that is based on Whitby. So it's this northeastern town on the coast, and the people living in this town really depended on whaling for their income. And so we get a lot of that, and it just was very, very stormy and gloomy, and there are descriptions of whaling and the ocean. It plays a big role in the story, and I just loved that setting so much. And it's also set against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars, and a big part of the story is also the press gangs, which I didn't really know much about, but that has to do with the British Navy recruiting men against their will. And there was just a lot of really interesting things going on in England at the time that I didn't really know much about, so it was really, really fascinating to learn. I think Gaskell is absolutely incredible at creating such emotional depth and really making the reader connect emotionally to these characters without even realizing it until she does something that completely shatters your heart. I haven't read a single book by Gaskell where her characters lacked depth or felt like caricatures or anything like that. She is just incredible. She was such a master at writing such complex characters. I just don't know what else to say. I adored this book so, so much, and I have one more book to read by Gaskell, which is Wives and Daughters, and I'm so excited to read it, but Sylvia's Lovers was just phenomenal. I adored it. Next up is The Premonition at Wither's Farm by Jamie Jo Wright. This is definitely my favorite by this author so far. I adored this book so, so much. And in this one, we have two timelines, as is usual with Jamie Jo Wright. She usually writes dual timeline, and we have 1910 Michigan and then modern day Michigan. And in the historical timeline, we have this woman named Herriot who lives with her mother, and her mother is known as kind of like a spiritualist, and she holds seances. And I was really hesitant to read this book because of that kind of thing going on, but I should have known to just trust the author that everything would work out. It is Christian fiction, so that's kind of why I was hesitant to read it. Basically, her mother is this spiritualist, and Herriot is known as this rural healer, and she really butts heads with the local doctor. A really eerie murder occurs, and Herriot is also supposedly targeted by this killer, and the doctor that she really butts heads with, he kind of has to help her. And along the way, they have such incredible discussions about faith versus superstition. And that's one reason why I loved this book so much, is the depth in the conversations that these characters were having, the struggles to reconcile certain things that they were experiencing. It felt so realistic and relatable. And then in our modern timeline, we have Molly, who is really struggling with her mental health. She and her husband have recently purchased this farmhouse, and she's really struggling with depression. She's had several miscarriages. Her marriage is not the best right now, and there are just a lot of things going on in her life that have led her to the state that she's currently in. She starts hearing these really weird voices, and some really creepy things are happening on this farmhouse that are connected to the old timeline. And the way that Jamie Jo Wright creates such tension and a creepy atmosphere, and it makes you question whether or not these things are really happening, if there's, you know, a normal explanation as to why things are happening the way they are. But she always comes in with the perfect resolution to everything. And this book had so much depth. It was very creepy. It was just the perfect autumn read, and I loved it so much. It's definitely my favorite by her so far. I just appreciated it so much. I appreciated the themes and the way that the characters were written and the really realistic issues they were having. And yeah, I just adored it. That is The Premonition at Wither's Farm. And the very last book for my top 10 reads of 2024 is The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. This book was perfection. I adored it so much. And I did recently talk about it actually in my mid-month wrap-up for December, so I'll have that video linked below. I adored this book so much. It is a thriller set in the 1700s in Maine, and it follows the events of a real court case that was happening, this trial, because this woman named Rebecca Foster had accused 2 men of raping her, and it's a very difficult read. It deals with very difficult topics, but our main character is a woman named Martha Ballard, who was a real midwife at the time, and so we get a lot of that midwifery and her medical expertise, and it was just perfection. One of the alleged rapists is actually found dead in the freezing Kennebec River, and Martha has to assess his body, and it's quite gruesome, but just such a powerful story that deals with such beautiful themes. Martha also kept a diary, and throughout the story we do get some snippets of that diary, which I thought was really cool. And on Goodreads, right at the end of the summary, it says, "Over the course of one winter, as the trial nears and whispers and prejudices mount, Martha doggedly pursues the truth. Her diary soon lands at the center of the scandal, implicating those she loves and compelling Martha to decide where her own loyalties lie." This book was fantastic. It was just perfection. Like I said, it's gruesome at times and deals with some very difficult topics like rape and childbirth and miscarriages, stillbirths, that kind of thing. So it's not for the faint of heart. It's not an easy read, but it is so powerful. And something that I found interesting, when I started reading it, I realized it was both in first person and present tense, which are my 2 least favorite narration styles. I'm definitely a third person, omniscient, past tense reader. That's what I prefer. But it worked so well in this book. The first person present was perfect for this type of read. You felt like you were there experiencing this cold winter and the very unsettling things going on in this small village in Maine, and it was definitely the right choice on the author's part to write it in that narration style. Even though I don't read Outlander anymore, I had read the first book and was familiar with the show a few years ago, and if any of you have seen Outlander or read the books, our main character Martha reminds me a lot of Claire. I just love how Martha was portrayed as a very, very strong woman. I believe she's in her 50s in the story, and she's so strong on her own as a woman, but she also has such a beautiful marriage with her husband Ephraim, and she's a wonderful mother. She has many kids, and motherhood was portrayed in a beautiful way. Marriage was portrayed so beautifully, and just everything about this book was perfection. I adored it so much, and I am so glad that I read it, and I know I will reread it in the future, and I can't wait to read more by this author. But friends, those are my favorite reads of 2024. I am just so happy with how the year went in terms of my reading. I read so many fantastic books, and I really hope that 2025 is the same. I really hope the new year is just full of wonderful, wonderful reads and new all-time favorites, and I'm just very hopeful that it will be a wonderful reading year for all of you as well. I would love to know what your top reads of the year are. If you wanted to give maybe a top 3, 5, 10, however many books you want to share in the comments, just let me know what your favorite reads of 2024 were. I would love to know, and if any of the books on my list are also on your list, I would love to know that as well. But friends, that is it for this video, and I do have one more BOOKMAS video to share, which will be coming out New Year's Eve, so I'll see you in that video. Bye.